How could I have missed this for so long? Victor muttered under his breath as he watched Marcus, one of his most dedicated employees, quietly slip a small container of food into his bag. Subscribe and write in the comments, where are you watching this video from? At first, the action seemed innocent, just another employee grabbing leftovers from the company cafeteria. But there was something in Marcus's behavior that raised a question in Victor's mind. The man was being too discreet, too cautious. It wasn't just food, it was the way he was hiding it, as if doing something forbidden. Victor couldn't help but feel a strange unease settle over him as he watched the scene unfold from the top-floor office window. Marcus had been with Harmon Logistics for nearly 4 years. He was a model employee, always on time, always going above and beyond, working long hours without complaint. His name was familiar to Victor from performance reports, and he had even been praised in several company meetings for his dedication. Yet here he was, acting as though he were committing some sort of theft. Victor's curiosity got the better of him, and he decided to follow Marcus as he left the building. He grabbed his coat, exited his office, and began to shadow the employee from a safe distance. The evening had arrived and the wind was biting, a sure sign that fall was settling in. To Victor's surprise, Marcus didn't head for the company parking lot as he expected. Instead, Marcus walked towards a nearby bus stop, his shoulders hunched and his movements slow, as though the weight of something far beyond work was bearing down on him. Why didn't he have a car? Why was he taking public transportation after working overtime? Victor's mind raced with questions as he followed him to the bus stop. The bus arrived and without thinking, Victor stepped on just behind Marcus, sitting several seats behind him. The bus took off, making its way through a district Victor wasn't familiar with. He had lived in this city for years, but he had never ventured into this part of town. The further they drove, the darker the streets became, and the more the city began to reveal a side Victor had never seen. As the bus turned onto a narrow road lined with broken streetlights, Victor's heart began to sink. Marcus got off the bus in a dilapidated neighborhood. The buildings were run down, and the streets were full of cracked sidewalks and crooked fences. It was a stark contrast to the polished world of corporate success that Victor inhabited. Marcus walked toward a modest apartment building, climbing a narrow set of stairs that creaked under his weight. From his vantage point, Victor could see through the thin curtains of the apartment window as the door opened. What he saw inside made his stomach churn. The apartment was sparse, almost empty. There were no sofas or tables, just a mattress on the floor and some plastic bins stacked haphazardly in the corner. The cheap lamp in the room illuminated the dark corners, casting long shadows. And then 2 small faces emerged from the shadows. Children. The moment they saw Marcus, they ran to him, throwing their arms around him in a warm embrace. It was a scene that made Victor's heart twist in his chest. Marcus wasn't stashing food for himself. He was hiding it for his children. The next scene made Victor's chest tighten. Marcus sat on the floor, pulling the container open carefully. He divided the food between the 2 children with a tenderness that made it clear they hadn't eaten much today, if at all. There was no food for Marcus. He simply watched them, a weary smile on his face, as they devoured the meal with the urgency of children who didn't know when they would eat again. Victor recoiled into the shadows, his mind racing. How was this possible? Marcus worked hard, often putting in overtime, and was constantly praised for his dedication. How could he barely afford food for his children? How could someone so committed to his work be living in such poverty? The math didn't add up. The salary seemed fair on paper, but the reality of Marcus's life painted a different picture. It was the first time Victor had begun to truly question whether the salary his company paid was enough to survive, let alone provide for a family. The privileged world Victor lived in was so far removed from the reality that Marcus was enduring, and it made him feel both guilty and confused. Victor stood frozen, watching the family inside the apartment, but feeling his own world shift around him. He realized that something had gone terribly wrong. If Marcus, one of the most dedicated employees, was struggling to feed his family despite working overtime, what did that say about the system Victor had spent years building? His company was thriving, so why wasn't it providing enough for the people who made that success possible? As the night continued, Victor couldn't shake the image of Marcus and his children sharing that meager meal. The guilt gnawed at him, and the questions in his mind kept growing louder. How many others in his company were living the same way? And how had he failed to notice it all this time? He felt a deep sense of responsibility for the people who worked for him. Victor had always believed that success was earned through hard work, but now he was beginning to see that the system he had created was far from fair, and it was time to confront the truth he had been avoiding. Victor's thoughts were interrupted as he realized that Marcus was about to leave. He stood up, gathered his children into a tight hug, and kissed them on the forehead. He left the apartment quietly and Victor followed at a distance. For the first time, the CEO of Harmon Logistics felt the weight of his own privilege, and it left him wondering just how many other employees like Marcus were struggling in silence, just trying to make it through each day. Victor thought he had seen it all until a single act revealed the truth about his empire, one that would shake his beliefs to their core. Victor woke up earlier than usual the next day, the events of the previous night gnawing at him. He had followed Marcus home, witnessed the reality that most of his employees faced, and seen things no one had ever shown him. His office felt colder than usual, despite the heat of the late morning sun filtering through the windows. It was as if the air itself had shifted, pressing down on him with the weight of 1,000 realizations. He sat at his desk, flipping through the reports he'd received over the years. His mind wandered back to the image of Marcus, kneeling on the floor, dividing a meager meal between his children. It was a sight he would never forget. A successful CEO, a man who had built his fortune from the ground up, was now questioning everything he had worked for. How had he not seen it before? For years, Victor had prided himself on his company's growth, its success, and the prosperity it had brought to countless employees. Yet here was one of his most dedicated workers, living in poverty, struggling to feed his children. How could that be? What had gone wrong? And more importantly, how had he become so blind to it? His assistant, Diane, interrupted his thoughts with a knock on the door. "Mr. Harmon, I have the new quarterly projections for you," she said, her voice crisp. He looked at her blankly for a moment before shaking his head. "Please, leave them on my desk. I'll get to them later." As Diane left, Victor turned back to the reports in front of him. The figures danced in front of his eyes, but he couldn't focus on them. He couldn't shake the image of Marcus, his tired eyes, his hunched shoulders, the way he had carried himself, like a man who had been beaten down by life. He couldn't help but wonder how many others in his company were silently suffering, just like Marcus. The truth hit him harder than he expected. His company's success had come at the expense of the very people who made it run, the ones working the long hours, the overtime, and the night shifts. They were the lifeblood of his empire, but somehow they were the ones being left behind. His heart sank as he realized that, in the pursuit of profit, he had overlooked the needs of his employees. Victor's thoughts were interrupted by his phone ringing. It was Rachel Kim, the HR director. She had been with the company for years and Victor trusted her insights. "Mr. Harmon," Rachel began, her tone cautious, "I've been going over the employee welfare reports, and I think we need to have a serious discussion." Victor's heart skipped a beat. He had a sinking feeling he knew what this conversation was about. "What's the problem, Rachel?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Rachel hesitated. "There are growing concerns about employee well-being, particularly in light of the rising cost of living. Many of our workers are struggling to make ends meet, despite putting in long hours. They're not getting the support they need from the company, and it's becoming a real issue." Victor felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "What kind of concerns?" he asked, his voice growing more tense. Rachel sighed. "Food insecurity, housing issues, the inability to afford health care. All of these problems are affecting our workers, particularly those in lower-level positions. We've had employees come to us asking for salary advances just to pay for basic necessities. And it's not just one or two people, it's widespread." Victor rubbed his temples, the weight of Rachel's words settling over him like a heavy blanket. He had heard of these issues in passing before, but he had never fully grasped the extent of the problem. Now that it was laid out before him, it felt like a punch to the gut. "Why haven't I seen these reports before?" Victor asked, his voice tinged with frustration. Rachel hesitated again. "They're often summarized before they reach you, Mr. Harmon. The Finance Committee has been filtering them out, deeming them too granular or irrelevant to the big picture. Victor stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. I want to see everything, he said firmly. All the reports, all the requests. I need to understand the full scope of this. Rachel nodded. I'll get everything to you right away. As she left, Victor felt a surge of anger and guilt wash over him. How had he let this go unnoticed for so long? How had he, a man who prided himself on being a leader, failed to see the suffering of his own employees? The hours that followed were a blur. Victor pored over the reports Rachel had provided, the numbers and statistics standing in stark contrast to the glossy, polished image of success his company had cultivated over the years. The disparity was shocking. Despite record profits, many of his employees were living paycheck to paycheck, struggling to afford basic necessities. The more he read, the more his anger grew. How could the finance committee have ignored these issues? How could the board have prioritized growth and expansion over the well-being of the people who made it all possible? As the day wore on, Victor felt a shift inside him. He couldn't continue down this path. He had built his empire on hard work, yes, but now he realized that hard work alone wasn't enough. His employees needed more than just a paycheck. They needed stability, support, and dignity. Victor made a decision. He would confront the board the next day. He would present the data, the undeniable truth about the inequalities within his company, and demand change. It wouldn't be easy, and he knew there would be resistance, but he was prepared to fight for what was right. He sat back in his chair, the weight of the upcoming battle settling on his shoulders. As he looked out the window at the city below, he realized that this was the moment that would define his legacy. He could continue down the path of greed and indifference, or he could choose to make a difference. And for the first time in his life, Victor Harmon knew exactly what he had to do. Victor stood in the boardroom, his mind racing. What if the truth he was about to reveal would change everything? The company he had built, the empire of profits and efficiency, all of it. Would it crumble under the weight of one man's struggle? He could feel the shift happening already, and as he faced the board members, he knew there was no turning back. The room went silent as Victor walked in, and Lawrence Parker, the chairman, eyed him suspiciously. He could already sense something was different today. Victor wasn't the same man he had been last week, and he knew it was about to show. The presentation began, and Victor's calm voice filled the room. We're going to start with this, he said as he clicked on the projector. On the screen appeared an image of Marcus's apartment, a small, run-down unit where two children sat on the floor, eating from a single container. The board froze, visibly uncomfortable. This is the apartment of one of our most dedicated employees, Victor continued. Marcus Jefferson has worked for Harmon Logistics for over 4 years. He's worked overtime, given his all for the company, and yet this is what he goes home to every night. This is his reality. The room was silent. Even Lawrence, who usually spoke up at every opportunity, was quiet. Victor clicked to the next slide. Data showing the staggering disparity between the salaries of the executives and the employees, with a clear racial gap in the wages. While executives have seen their bonuses increase by 22%, the employees we rely on, like Marcus, are barely getting by, Victor stated. And this isn't just one isolated case. This is a trend that's happening across our entire company. He looked around the room, his eyes locking with each of the board members. How did we let this happen? He asked, his voice rising. How did we let this broken system continue when the people who work the hardest for us can't even feed their families? Lawrence shifted uncomfortably, but Victor wasn't finished. He continued presenting data, graphs showing the increasing cost of living, the wage stagnation, and the racial disparities. Then he showed the reports from HR, revealing how many employees were facing eviction, food insecurity, and worse, yet still showing up to work every day, just to get by. The system is broken, Victor said, and we have a choice. We can either continue down this path, or we can fix it. But if we're going to fix it, we need to act now. The room buzzed with murmurs, but Lawrence finally spoke up. Victor, we understand your concern, but these changes are drastic. You're asking us to change the entire structure of the company. You're asking us to sacrifice profits for the sake of employees. Victor didn't flinch. I'm not asking for a sacrifice, he said, his voice calm but unwavering. "I'm asking for a change in priorities. This company's success shouldn't just be about profit. It should be about people. It's time we build a system that supports those who build this company." The board members exchanged glances, but Victor could see the shift happening. They weren't all convinced, but there was a growing understanding that things couldn't go on the way they had. "Here's my proposal," Victor continued, pulling up the next slide. "An immediate 30% pay increase for all employees below management level, expanded childcare programs, transportation and housing subsidies, and an emergency fund for medical needs." The room was dead silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Lawrence scoffed. "Victor, this will cost millions. It's not financially viable. This is a company, not a charity." Victor leaned forward, his voice firm. "We've spent millions on expansion and increasing shareholder value. Now it's time to spend on the people who make this company work. You can't continue to ignore the fact that the system we've built is crushing the people who make us successful." Diane Harper, one of the influential shareholders, finally spoke. "Victor, I don't agree with everything you're saying, but I can see the point. The numbers are hard to ignore." Victor nodded. "We need to build a future that's sustainable for everyone. A company that values fairness, equality, and opportunity." There was a pause as the room digested his words. Then Diane spoke again, more thoughtfully this time. "Victor, you're right. We can't keep ignoring this, but it's going to take time. We can't make all these changes overnight." Victor's response was simple. "We can't afford to wait. Not if we want to build something that will last." After a few more tense moments, the room fell into agreement. It wasn't the perfect solution, but it was a start. The changes would begin immediately, but Victor knew this was only the beginning of the work that needed to be done. It wasn't just about the pay raises. It was about dismantling the systems that kept people like Marcus on the margins. It was about reshaping the future. Victor walked out of the meeting, his heart racing, but a sense of relief washed over him. The battle had just begun, but he knew this was the right fight. When he passed Marcus in the hallway, Victor paused. He saw the man who had unknowingly sparked this transformation, his shoulders hunched with exhaustion, his tired eyes filled with the weight of unspoken struggles. And for the first time, Victor didn't just see an employee. He saw a man, a father, someone who had been invisible for far too long. The changes Victor had started to set in motion weren't just for the company. They were for Marcus, for his children, and for every person who had been left behind by a system that didn't care. And as the first steps toward that change were being taken, Victor knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But he also knew, without a doubt, that it was the road worth walking. Title: The Shifting Paradigm. What if the very system you built was the one holding people back? Victor stared out the window of his top-floor office, his thoughts tangled with the reality he had just uncovered. The weight of his discoveries pressed down on him like a storm cloud ready to burst. Everything he had known about success, about meritocracy, was now in question. The truth was undeniable, and Victor realized that change wasn't just necessary, it was urgent. After the board meeting, the weeks that followed felt like a whirlwind. Victor had successfully implemented his proposal, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something far larger. Marcus's promotion to wellness coordinator was just the first of many shifts that would ripple through the company. The deeper issues were still there, lurking beneath the surface. As Victor walked through the hallways of Harmon Logistics, he couldn't ignore the undercurrent of change that had begun to take hold. Employees who had once seemed invisible were now speaking up. The cafeteria had become a hub of conversation, with people discussing the new initiatives and the possibilities that had opened up for them. The benefits were starting to make a difference. People were beginning to breathe easier. Still, Victor couldn't escape the nagging thought that the changes he had initiated might not be enough. He had seen the way Marcus's eyes had lit up when he received his promotion. He had witnessed firsthand the shift in Marcus's demeanor, his pride, his newfound sense of purpose. But there were still so many employees like Marcus, working hard, often without recognition, caught in a system that never quite allowed them to rise above the surface. It was a cycle, a trap that was difficult to escape. Victor couldn't help but think back to that night when he had followed Marcus home. The image of Marcus's small, rundown apartment and the way his children had clung to him as he handed them their meager meal haunted him. It wasn't just the physical poverty that struck Victor. It was the emotional toll, the constant struggle that never seemed to end. As the days passed, Victor found himself spending more time with Marcus. They had lunch together on several occasions, talking about everything from work to family, to their differing perspectives on the world. Marcus had become more open, more willing to share his story. It was a quiet friendship that Victor didn't expect, but it was one that grew stronger with each passing conversation. "I'm just trying to make sure they have enough," Marcus said one afternoon, his voice filled with quiet determination. "It's not just about the job. It's about making sure they don't go to bed hungry." Victor nodded, his mind working through the implications of Marcus's words. The idea of working tirelessly for years and still struggling to make ends meet seemed impossible. Yet it was a reality for so many people in his company, people who, like Marcus, gave everything they had, only to be left with so little. The corporate world had always been about numbers, profits, efficiency, growth. But now Victor was starting to see that the real measure of success wasn't just in the spreadsheets. It was in the lives of the people who made that success possible. And those lives, he realized, were being neglected, even exploited in the name of profit. Victor had always believed in the importance of hard work. It was the foundation of his empire, the reason he had climbed the ranks to become CEO. But now he began to question whether hard work alone was enough. In his pursuit of success, he had failed to recognize the systemic barriers that held people like Marcus back. His vision had been narrow, focused only on the end result, not the human cost of getting there. It was a realization that stung, but it was also one that drove him forward. He had already made changes within the company, improvements that had helped some employees. But what about the rest? What about the ones who hadn't yet received the help they needed? What about the people who were still invisible, working in the shadows, unseen and unheard? Victor knew he couldn't stop now. The changes he had implemented were just the beginning. It wasn't enough to just provide better wages and benefits. He needed to address the root causes of inequality, the bias in promotions, the racial disparities in pay, the systemic obstacles that kept people from reaching their full potential. It wasn't just about helping a few. It was about changing the system for everyone. The next step was clear. Victor needed to build a comprehensive plan, one that would address the deeper issues at play. He needed to create a culture where everyone had the opportunity to succeed, not just the privileged few. It was a vision that would require more than just policy changes. It would require a shift in the company's values, a commitment to equity that ran deeper than profit margins. But there was resistance. Victor knew there would be pushback from the board. They had always prioritized profit over people, and he knew that they wouldn't easily accept these new ideas. But he couldn't afford to back down. This wasn't just about the future of his company. It was about the future of his employees, the people who had worked so hard to build Harmon Logistics into what it was today. He spent the following weeks working on his plan, meeting with Rachel, the HR director, and other trusted colleagues to refine the details. They analyzed the company's financials, assessed the current compensation structure, and developed a strategy that would address the racial pay gap, improve workplace diversity, and provide better opportunities for advancement for all employees, especially those who had been overlooked for far too long. Victor knew it wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that it was the right thing to do. And when the time came to present the plan to the board, he walked in with a confidence that surprised even him. He had seen the impact of his actions already. Marcus had been promoted, and other employees were beginning to feel the positive effects of the new policies. But the real test was what would happen next. Would the board accept this vision for the future, or would they cling to the old ways? As he stood before them, ready to present his vision, Victor understood that this was more than just a business decision. It was a moral one. The world was changing, and the corporate world had to change with it. If Harmon Logistics wanted to thrive in the future, it needed to embrace fairness, equity, and responsibility. There was no turning back now. The room fell silent as Victor began his presentation, his voice steady, but his heart racing. He knew this was the moment that would define everything. And as he spoke, he realized that, in this fight for justice, he was no longer just the CEO of Harmon Logistics. He was a man fighting for the future of his employees, for their families, for the people who had always been there, working tirelessly in the shadows, invisible no longer. What if the truth of your company's success was a lie built on the backs of those you overlooked? Victor stared at the boardroom, his mind heavy with the responsibility of the decision he was about to make. The company he had built, the empire that had made him rich, was at a crossroads. For years, he had believed that the success of Harmon Logistics was due to his hard work, his vision. But now he saw the truth. Victor had always prided himself on being a self-made man, believing in the power of merit and hard work. He had climbed to the top through sheer determination, his ambition burning brighter than any obstacle. But now, as he looked around the room at the well-dressed faces of the board members, he couldn't shake the feeling that his success had come at a cost that was hidden beneath the polished surface of the company's financial reports. The numbers were clear. While executives received raises and bonuses, the employees who built the company from the ground up were struggling. Many were living below the poverty line, working long hours and still unable to provide for their families. The disparity was not just financial, it was also racial. The Black and Latino employees were disproportionately affected, trapped in a system that seemed designed to keep them from rising. Victor had seen it all. He had watched Marcus, a model employee, go above and beyond for the company, only to struggle at home, feeding his children scraps of food. The realization had hit him hard. Marcus wasn't an anomaly. He was just one example of the many employees who were working themselves into the ground for a paycheck that barely covered the basics of life. The system he had built, the company he had nurtured, was broken. And now Victor was faced with a choice. He could continue down the same path, clinging to the outdated ideals of profit and growth, or he could make a change, a real change, one that would not only address the issues of fairness and equity, but would fundamentally alter the way his company operated. The meeting with the board was set for that afternoon, and Victor knew it was time to act. He couldn't let this moment pass without standing up for what was right. He had already made up his mind. He would challenge the system, even if it meant risking everything he had built. As the clock ticked down, Victor's thoughts turned to Marcus and the other employees who had been living in the shadows of the company's success. He thought about the sacrifices they made, the struggles they endured, and the hope that had been crushed under the weight of a system that had never been designed to lift them up. These were the people who had made Harmon Logistics what it was, but they had never been recognized for their contributions. They were invisible. Victor could no longer ignore the inequality that had become ingrained in the company's culture. He had spent so many years focused on growth and profit, convinced that success was the result of hard work alone. But now he understood that success wasn't just about working hard. It was about having the opportunity to succeed in the first place. And that was something many of his employees didn't have. When the time came to address the board, Victor walked into the room with a sense of determination that he had never felt before. He had gathered all the data, the numbers, the reports, the personal stories. He knew that the facts spoke for themselves. But it wasn't just about the data. It was about the people behind the numbers, the people who had worked tirelessly, day in and day out, to build the company, only to be left behind. Victor began his presentation with a calm but unwavering voice, presenting the facts that had been hidden for too long. He showed the board the disparity in wages, the systemic barriers that had kept certain groups from advancing, and the personal stories of employees like Marcus. He didn't hold back. He made it clear that the company could no longer ignore the reality that existed outside the boardroom. Lawrence Parker, the chairman of the board, shifted uncomfortably in his seat as Victor spoke. The other members exchanged nervous glances, their faces betraying the unease they felt. They had always relied on the status quo to protect their interests. They were comfortable with the way things had been. But Victor wasn't asking for their approval anymore. He was demanding change. "We've been blind," Victor said, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "We've been blind to the struggles of our employees, to the inequality that has been built into our system. But that stops today. We are going to change the way we operate. We are going to put people before profits, and we are going to build a company where everyone has the opportunity to succeed." The room fell silent. For the first time, the board members were confronted with the reality that their success had been built on the backs of those who had been left behind. Victor had taken off the blinders, and now they could see the truth. It was uncomfortable, it was difficult, but it was necessary. Victor's proposal was simple but revolutionary. A 30% salary increase for all employees below management level, with a focus on addressing the racial pay gap. He also proposed housing subsidies, a child care program, expanded health benefits, and an emergency fund to support employees in times of crisis. It was a bold plan, one that would require significant financial adjustments, but Victor knew it was the right thing to do. The board members were skeptical. They argued about the financial implications, the potential backlash from shareholders, and the long-term viability of the plan. But Victor stood firm. He wasn't asking for their approval. He was telling them what needed to be done. This wasn't about money. It was about justice. As the meeting dragged on, Victor could see the resistance in the room. Lawrence Parker, in particular, was furious. He argued that the company's focus should be on expansion and profitability, not on social responsibility. But Victor wasn't backing down. "You want to talk about profit?" Victor said, his voice rising. "Our employees are the ones who make this company successful. They're the ones who work day and night to build this empire. Without them, none of this exists. And if we don't take care of them, we're going to lose everything. I don't care about the bonuses. I care about the people who built this company." The tension in the room was palpable. Victor knew this was a turning point, a moment that would define the future of Harmon Logistics. It was a fight he was willing to lose, but he wasn't willing to lose his integrity. This wasn't just about the company's future. It was about doing what was right. In the end, the vote was close. The board members were divided, but Victor's passionate argument swayed enough people to secure the vote in his favor. The changes would be implemented, and Harmon Logistics would begin its transformation into a company that truly valued its employees. As the meeting adjourned, Victor stood up, his heart pounding with a mixture of relief and determination. He had won this battle, but the war was just beginning. There was still much work to be done. The changes he had proposed would take time to implement, and there would be resistance along the way. But Victor was ready. He had made a promise to himself, to Marcus, and to every employee who had ever felt overlooked or invisible. He would fight for them, no matter the cost. Walking out of the boardroom, Victor felt a sense of purpose he had never known before. He had set the wheels of change in motion, and nothing would stop him now. The real work was just beginning, but Victor knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to rest until Harmon Logistics became the company it was meant to be. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Watch our next video to discover another powerful journey and share this one with someone who needs to hear.